There is a specific, almost sacred frequency that exists inside the flight deck of a commercial airliner at night, a sound that is less heard than it is felt, a low, oscillating hum of circulating fans and avionics cooling systems that creates a blanket of white noise, effectively sealing the occupants away from the chaotic world below. If you were to sit in the left seat of a Boeing 737, looking out through the thick, multi-layered glass of the windscreen while rain streaks horizontally across your field of vision, the universe would reduce itself to two distinct realities: the warm, amber and green glow of the instrument panel in front of you, and the cold, blurry grid of city lights drifting quietly beneath the clouds. When we walk down the jet bridge, dragging our luggage across the industrial carpet, and step across the threshold into the fuselage, we are engaging in a profound, unspoken social contract, surrendering our control to a hierarchy of systems we assume are infallible. We place an immense, fragile weight of trust in the machine, in the hydraulics, the curvature of the aluminum wings, and the precise combustion of the engines, but even more than the machine, we trust the uniform. We believe, without hesitation, that the gold stripes on the epaulets and the confident, practiced cadence of the voice over the intercom are the result of rigorous vetting, a catalog of examinations, and a documented history of competence that is locked away in a government archive. But one must ask, in the quiet hours of the night, what happens when the uniform is authentic? The skills are undeniable, but the man inhabiting that role is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. On a quiet, rain-slicked morning in Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport in March of the year 2010, a man named Thomas Salmi sat comfortably in the cockpit of a Corendon Airlines Boeing 737, preparing for a routine departure that he had simulated in his mind 1,000 times before. He moved through the pre-flight checklist with a fluidity that can only be born of obsession, his hands dancing over the overhead panel, checking the fuel pumps, the hydraulic pressure, and the yaw damper with a muscle memory that felt entirely natural. He knew the precise weight of the fuel required to reach Ankara. He understood the aerodynamic nuances of the descent profile, and he could navigate the complex labyrinth of European airspace with the ease of a man walking through his own living room. However, as the passengers settled into their seats and the cabin crew armed the doors, Thomas Salmi was guarding a secret that was as heavy as the aircraft itself, a hollow void in his personal history that he had successfully hidden for 13 years. While he possessed the uniform, the knowledge, and the seat, he did not possess the one essential piece of laminated paper that said he was allowed to be there. Tonight, beneath the steady rhythm of the falling rain, we open the dusty file on the phantom captain, a man who flew 10,000 flights on silence alone, navigating the skies not just with instruments, but with a psychological audacity that defies belief. Before we trace the trajectory of this deception, which spanned airlines from Air One to Corendon and crossed borders with impunity, it is vital that we establish the nature of the story we are about to unravel. When we speak of aviation mysteries, the mind instinctively braces for the sound of alarms, the chaotic static of a distress call, or the tragic, fragmented conclusion of a flight that never reached its destination. We are conditioned by the history of forensic investigations to expect a debris field, a scorched scar on the earth, or the somber recovery of the flight data recorder from the depths of the ocean. I must assure you, however, that the file of Thomas Salmi contains no such tragedy. There is no smoke, no fire, and no loss of life to disturb your rest tonight. Instead, what we have is a puzzle of paperwork and psychology, a masquerade that lasted for over a decade in one of the most heavily regulated, surveilled, and cataloged environments on the face of the earth. This is not a story of incompetence or malice, but rather a study in how a single human being managed to slip through the cracks of a monolithic system existing in a dormant state within the very databases designed to identify him. It forces us to ask a question that is both unsettling and strangely fascinating. How does a man hide in plain sight, surrounded by colleagues, co-pilots, and security personnel, while performing a job that requires absolute transparency? Is it possible that the complex bureaucratic systems we rely on, the background checks, the license verifications, the digital archives, are actually so vast and labyrinthine that they create blind spots large enough for a man to fly a 70-ton jet through them? As we sift through the timeline of his career, we will find that the mechanism of his deception was not a sophisticated forgery or a digital hack, but rather a manipulation of human assumption and the quiet confidence that comes with wearing a well-tailored suit. We are looking at a case where the patina of authority was so convincing that no one thought to ask for the proof beneath it. The resolution of this story lies not in a crash investigation, but in the quiet, almost anticlimactic moment when the fiction finally dissolved into the ether, leaving behind only the man and the truth he had outrun for so long. Let us transport ourselves back to the atmosphere of those early years, visualizing the silhouette of a pilot walking across a wet tarmac under the harsh glare of floodlights, his reflection distorted in the pools of water that have collected on the asphalt. Imagine the scent of jet fuel hanging heavy in the damp air, a sensory detail that becomes as familiar as the smell of morning coffee, grounding the imposter in a reality that feels undeniably concrete. There is a specific loneliness to this image, a solitary figure moving through the industrial vastness of an airport, surrounded by the deafening roar of engines and the constant movement of baggage carts, yet utterly isolated by the secret he carries in his flight bag. The rain continues to fall, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that washes over the fuselage, mimicking the constant, low-level anxiety that must have oscillated in the back of Thomas Salmi's mind every time he stepped onto the flight deck. In the world of noir sleep detective, we are less interested in the sensational headlines and more focused on the internal weather of the subject, the gray, overcast landscape of a mind that has constructed a labyrinth of lies and must now live within it. As the sound of the rain intensifies slightly, blending with the low, ambient drone of the background, we begin our descent into the deep history of this case, peeling back the layers of time to understand not just what he did, but how the world allowed him to do it. It is a story that requires us to slow down, to examine the texture of the documents, the color of the lanyards, and the subtle social cues that allow a man to become invisible while standing center stage. We move now from the hook of the mystery into the procedural body of the narrative, drifting away from the shock of the revelation and settling into the calm, methodical examination of the facts. The city lights below are blurring into a singular glow. The radio chatter has faded to a murmur, and we are left alone in the cockpit with the phantom captain ready to understand the architecture of his 13-year flight. To fully comprehend how a man like Thomas Salmi could navigate the labyrinth of international aviation without detection for over a decade, we must first immerse ourselves in the texture of the world as it existed in the late 1992 and the early years of the new millennium, a time when the digital horizon was still distant and the machinery of society operated on a frequency of physical interaction. It was an era defined by the weight of paper rather than the speed of fiber optics, a period where the authority of a pilot was contained not in a centralized server farm, but in the tactile reality of a leather logbook, heavy with the scent of old binding and ink. When we think of the airports of this time, before the sterile silence of modern terminals where information is displayed on silent LED screens, we remember the hypnotic, rhythmic clatter of the split-flap display boards, their mechanical letters flipping over in a cascade of movement that announced departures to Rome, London, and New York with a sound that felt like rain falling on a tin roof. In this analog landscape, a license was a physical artifact, a piece of cardstock that could be held, stamped, and filed away in a metal cabinet that might remain dormant for years in a dusty basement archive. The verification process was not an instantaneous query sent through the ether to a global database, but a slow, bureaucratic oscillation of letters and faxes that relied heavily on the presumption of honesty, moving at a pace that seems almost glacial by today's standards. Do you remember a time when the world moved a little slower, when the gaps between nations felt wider, and a signature on a page carried more weight than a digital fingerprint? It is within these gaps, these hollow spaces between the fax machine and the filing cabinet, that the phantom captain found the room to construct his legend. As Salmi moved through the terminals of Europe, carrying the heavy flight bag that contained the operating manuals for the Boeing 737 manuals that were thick, printed blocks of text rather than files on a tablet, he was protected by the sheer inefficiency of the system. The carbon copy paper used for flight plans, with its distinct chemical smell and the faint blue residue it left on the fingertips, served as a testament to a process that was thorough yet disconnected. Each flight involved a ritual of paperwork, a stacking of forms and manifests that were physically signed and then physically transported to an office, where they would be placed into a folder, becoming just another fragment in a mountain of administrative data that no one had the time or the inclination to audit. The airports themselves were different then. They were often filled with a haze of cigarette smoke that hung in the air like a suspended velvet curtain, diffusing the harsh, fluorescent lighting and softening the edges of the waiting crowds. Outside, on the rain-slicked tarmac, the air was thick with the heavy, oily aroma of kerosene, a scent that clings to clothing and hair, marking those who work near the engines with an olfactory badge of their trade. In this environment, where the noise of the engines was muffled by the thick glass of the terminal but still present as a low-frequency vibration in the floor, the culture was one of handshake agreements and visual assessments. When Salme presented his credentials to a new employer, perhaps a hiring manager at Air One or a recruiter for a contract agency, the documents he handed over possessed the requisite patina of legitimacy. The slight fraying at the edges, the softness that comes from being handled repeatedly, which silently communicated that this was a veteran pilot, not a fraud. It is a curious psychological phenomenon that we trust an object that appears worn, assuming that its degradation is proof of its history, rather than considering that the history itself might be a fabrication constructed with careful precision. His logbook, the sacred catalog of his flight hours, was a masterpiece of creative writing, detailing imaginary approaches into fog-bound runways and night landings under minimum visibility, each entry penned in precise, unwavering blue ink. Because the cross-referencing of these logs against the actual archives of the aviation authorities was a task requiring weeks of manual labor, involving international telephone calls and the physical mailing of requests, the airlines simply accepted the narrative presented to them, placing their faith in the physical object rather than the invisible truth. The industry was built on a foundation of honor, on the assumption that no one would be foolish enough to fake the qualifications for a job that carried such immense responsibility and danger. Salmi understood this assumption, and he exploited the silence of the archives, knowing that as long as he did not give them a reason to look, the files would remain closed. The manuals he carried, detailing the curvature of the wing and the flow of fuel during the descent, were not merely props. They were the scriptures of his chosen religion, and he studied them until the pages were soft and the corners bent. In the cockpit of the 737, surrounded by the analog gauges that twitched and spun with mechanical feedback, he was a man comfortably insulated by the limitations of the technology around him. The static on the radio, the crackle of the transmission from the tower, and the mechanical thud of the landing gear locking into place were the sounds of a world where things were mechanical, repairable, and, crucially, hideable. Even as the years progressed and the industry began its slow migration toward the digital, transforming the obsidian darkness of the unknown into a lit grid of data, Salmi remained embedded in the old ways, a relic of the paper age surviving in a changing ecosystem. He relied on the fact that the transition was not uniform, that while some airlines were modernizing their records, others were still operating with filing systems that had not changed since the 1,970 seconds. He existed in the overlap, in the gray area where a photocopy of a license was as good as the license itself, provided the laminate was smooth and the font was correct. It is almost hypnotic to consider the sheer volume of paper that he must have generated over 13 years. Thousands of fuel slips, load sheets, and technical logs, each one bearing his signature, each one a small, localized lie that contributed to the larger tapestry of his deception. These documents are now likely destroyed or lost to the damp rot of a storage facility. But, for a time, they were the only reality that mattered, the paper bricks that built the wall behind which Thomas Salmi hid. As we drift further into the story, we must keep this texture in mind. The feel of the paper, the smell of the ink, and the quiet, trusting atmosphere of a world that had not yet learned to doubt everything it saw. To truly understand the architecture of this deception, we must peel away the layers of the airline captain's uniform and examine the man who existed before the stripes, before the forged documents, and before the thousands of hours logged in the upper atmosphere. Thomas Salmi was not born into the criminal underworld, nor was he a con artist in the traditional sense, seeking financial gain through theft or manipulation of the vulnerable. He was, at his core, a technician of his own destiny, a man possessed by a quiet, methodical fascination with the way things worked, whether it was the shutter mechanism of a camera or the hydraulic systems of a commercial airliner. Before he was the phantom captain, Salmi was a photographer and a maintenance engineer, roles that require a specific type of personality, one that values observation, precision, and an appreciation for the intricate details that others might overlook. In the late hours of the night, while the city of Stockholm lay dormant under the heavy velvet blanket of the Scandinavian winter, Salmi found himself drawn to the industrial starkness of Arlanda Airport, a place where the static of the radio and the smell of jet fuel felt more like home than any apartment ever could. He did not crave the adulation that comes with walking through a terminal while travelers gaze in admiration. He craved the mechanics of flight, the pure, unadulterated interaction between human input and machine response. It is here, in the shadows of the hangars, that we find the true origin of his obsession, rooted not in ego, but in a deep, resonant desire to master the complex systems that allow 70 tons of aluminum to defy the curvature of the Earth. Access is a curious commodity. Often, it is granted not to those who demand it, but to those who are simply present, hovering on the periphery with a quiet persistence that renders them invisible. Through his connections in the maintenance world and his friendship with a simulation technician, Salmi gained unauthorized entry to the SAS Scandinavian Airlines flight simulator located at Arlanda. This was not the sleek, digital experience of modern gaming, but a massive, hydraulic beast, a box on stilts that groaned and hissed as it replicated the physical sensations of flight with terrifying accuracy. Imagine the scene. The hangar is silent, save for the distant hum of cleaning crews and the oscillation of the heating vents. Salmi steps into the simulator, the heavy door sealing him inside a cockpit that is an exact replica of the McDonnell Douglas MD-80 or the Boeing 737. The outside world ceases to exist, replaced by the projected horizon of a digital runway and the warm, amber glow of the instrument cluster. For hours, while the legitimate pilots slept in their hotels, Salmi would sit in the left seat, his hands resting gently on the yoke, teaching himself the delicate art of the descent. He treated these sessions not as a game, but as a rigorous academic pursuit, a self-imposed university where the curriculum was written in the language of altitude, airspeed, and angle of attack. He learned to interpret the subtle feedback of the controls, feeling the simulated resistance of the air against the ailerons, mastering the rhythm of the scan, the constant visual loop from the attitude indicator to the altimeter to the airspeed and back again. It was a private, solitary education conducted in the vacuum of the simulator, where he could crash 1,000 times without consequence, refining his technique until the movements became fluid, almost subconscious. There is a profound irony in this phase of his life. He learned to fly before he learned to lie. He possessed a private pilot license, a legitimate document that proved he understood the basics of aviation, but the chasm between a private license and the air transport pilot license required to fly commercial jets is vast, filled with financial hurdles and regulatory checkpoints that Salmi could not overcome. The training for an ATPL is a costly, time-consuming catalog of requirements, a gatekeeping mechanism designed to filter out those who lack the resources or the endurance to complete it. Salmi sat in that simulator, watching the artificial rain streak across the virtual windshield, and realized that his skill had outpaced his paperwork. He knew the procedures, he knew the emergency checklists, he knew the precise frequency settings for the navigation aids. In his mind, the license was merely a receipt, a bureaucratic formality that had no bearing on his actual ability to safely operate the machine. It was during these long, lonely sessions in the dark, surrounded by the hum of the avionics cooling fans, that the idea began to drift into his consciousness, not as a sudden, frantic decision, but as a slow, logical conclusion to a problem he had already solved mechanically. He looked at the empty seat beside him and realized that the only difference between him and the captains he admired was a piece of paper in a file folder, somewhere in a government archive. If he could produce that paper, if he could laminate a forgery that looked convincing enough to pass a casual inspection, the simulator would no longer be a cage. It would be a gateway. The obsession with the machine had morphed into a necessity to bypass the system, creating a shadow self that would allow him to do the one thing he loved more than anything else. He did not want to hurt anyone. He simply wanted to belong to the sky. And so, the photographer who understood how to frame a picture began to frame a life, constructing a background that was as detailed and precise as the flight plans he would later file. The oscillation between the man he was a skilled enthusiast without the means to advance and the man he wanted to be a respected captain of a commercial liner began to slow, until the two images merged into a single, seamless entity. As he walked out of the simulator in the early hours of the morning, his eyes adjusting to the harsh lights of the hangar, the decision had settled in his mind like sediment in a still lake. He would not wait for the permission that might never come. He would take the skills he had honed in the dark and bring them into the light, relying on the assumption that if he flew with enough precision, no one would ever think to ask if he was real. The simulator had taught him how to handle the plane. Now he would have to teach himself how to handle the world that watched it. In the quiet, solitary hours that define the life of a man harboring a secret, the creation of a new identity is not a digital act of hacking a remote server, but a physical, tactile process that belongs to an era we have largely left behind. We must transport ourselves back to a time when legitimacy was not a query sent through the ether to a centralized database, but a tangible quality held in the hand, a matter of paper density, watermarks, and the precise, authoritative sound of a rubber stamp hitting a page. For Thomas Salmi, the transformation from an enthusiast to a commercial captain did not occur in the cockpit of a Boeing 737, but rather at a desk cluttered with the analog tools of the forger's trade, where the static of the room was broken only by the rhythmic clatter of keys and the slide of scissors against paper. It is fascinating to consider that the barrier between the ground and the sky, between the layperson and the professional, was often nothing more than a single sheet of cardstock, a fragile shield against the world that relied entirely on the confidence of the bearer to maintain its structural integrity. The document in question was a Swedish Civil Aviation Administration license, a piece of bureaucratic paperwork that carried the weight of the state and the implicit trust of the aviation community. To replicate such an item in the late 1990 seconds required a specific type of artistry, a keen understanding of the visual language of authority, and the patience to ensure that every fragment of the fabrication aligned perfectly with reality. He did not need to bypass a firewall or decrypt a password. He needed to understand the texture of the paper, the specific shade of blue ink used by the regulators, and the exact font that had been cataloged in the official style guides of the administration. Imagine the scene as a process of slow, deliberate construction, where Salm, utilizing a mixture of authentic templates and creative improvisation, began to assemble the collage that would become his career. He likely started with legitimate documents, perhaps his own private pilot license or expired certificates, and used them as the foundation, carefully altering the text to reflect qualifications he had not earned but felt he possessed in spirit. This was a craft of oscillation between the real and the imaginary, where a typewriter or an early word processor was used to print new ratings, instrument clearance, multi-engine certification, and the coveted type rating for the jet aircraft he intended to fly. The physical act of cutting and pasting was not a metaphor in those days. It was a literal cutting of paper strips, aligning them with a surgeon's steady hand over the existing text, and then photocopying the composite image until the seams disappeared into the grain of the new page. The goal was to create a document that possessed a certain patina, a look of dull, administrative boredom that would prevent anyone from staring at it too closely. A pristine, flawless document often invites suspicion, but one that looks standard, perhaps slightly imperfect in its alignment, feels authentically human and therefore trustworthy. Once the layout was finalized, the most critical step was the lamination, a process that effectively sealed the lie inside a protective layer of plastic, preserving it for the years to come. There is a sense of finality in the heating of the laminate pouch, the way the plastic melts and bonds to the paper, blurring the edges of the alterations and giving the card a unified, professional gloss that reflects the overhead lights of an office. When Salme held the finished product, feeling its cool, smooth surface and the rigidity of the plastic, he was holding the key to the horizon, a simple object that would allow him to walk through security checkpoints and onto the flight decks of major airlines like Air One and Corendon. It is a profound meditation on the nature of trust to realize that this single piece of plastic, no larger than a credit card, was the only thing standing between him and discovery. When he presented it to a potential employer, he was banking on the fact that the person across the desk would see the form rather than the substance, accepting the muffled reflection of the laminate as proof of the history written beneath it. The license sat in his wallet or his flight bag, a dormant threat that was also his greatest asset, always present, always waiting to be inspected. He had to ensure that the document aged with him, that it did not look like a fresh forgery but like a well-traveled companion that had seen the inside of many cockpits and endured the rigors of the job. Perhaps he allowed it to sit in the sun to fade slightly, or bent the corners to simulate the wear and tear of a working pilot, adding a layer of authenticity that no digital file could ever replicate. The psychology here is intricate. By treating the forgery with the casual indifference one affords a real document, he projected a subconscious signal that there was nothing to hide. As he moved through the world, crossing borders and time zones, that small, laminated rectangle was the anchor that kept his story from drifting away into the static. It was a hollow validation, a shell without a pearl, but in the analog labyrinth of the late 90s and early 2000s, it was enough to satisfy the gatekeepers. The curvature of his career was defined by this object, a physical manifestation of his desire to ascend, proving that in a world built on paper, the man who holds the right paper holds the power, regardless of whether the words printed on it are true. To understand how 13 years can dissolve into the ether without a single raised eyebrow, without a momentary hesitation from a co-pilot or a suspicious glance from a check airman, we must embrace the paradox of the boring. In the high-stakes world of commercial aviation, where the margin for error is measured in seconds and feet, the greatest camouflage for an imposter is not charisma or deflection, but an absolute, unyielding adherence to the mundane. Thomas Salme was never caught during those thousands of flights for Air One and Corendon because he understood that the safest place to hide was inside the rigid, procedural skeleton of the job itself. If you were to watch him work, observing the way he moved within the confined space of the Boeing 737 flight deck, you would not see a man looking over his shoulder, but rather a technician fully absorbed in the oscillation of the machine. The cockpit is a sanctuary of order, a place where every action has a corresponding reaction and where the chaos of the world below is filtered out through a checklist that has been refined over decades of aerospace engineering. It is in this mechanical rhythm that we find the true texture of his deception, a daily ritual that protected him like a suit of armor made of velvet and steel. Let us close our eyes and drift into the specific hypnotic cadence of the startup procedure, the sequence of events that Salme performed over 10,000 times, a ritual that anchored him to the reality of the aircraft while distancing him from the falsity of his credentials. The aircraft sits dormant at the gate, a cold, dark mass of aluminum and wire waiting for the breath of life, and the pilot enters the flight deck, the air smelling of recycled plastic and the faint, lingering scent of ozone. The process begins not with a roar, but with a single, precise click. His hand moves to the overhead panel, locating the battery switch under its guarded cover, and with a practiced motion, he flips it to the on position, watching as the cockpit awakens from its slumber. The screens do not flash blindingly. Rather, they flicker with a soft, amber resonance, casting a warm glow over the throttle quadrant, while the DC meter indicates the flow of energy from the battery to the essential buses. Standby power, auto, he whispers to the empty room, his voice barely audible over the sudden rush of the cooling fans that kick in to protect the avionics. His finger moves to the right, checking the hydraulic pumps. Electric 1 and 2. Engine 1 and 2 ensuring they are in the off position to prevent the flight controls from moving inadvertently on the ramp, a safety measure that protects the ground crew walking beneath the curvature of the wings. Next, the fire. Overheat warning test. He presses the button, and for a moment, the cockpit is filled with the rhythmic chiming of the fire bell, a sound that might induce panic in a layman but is music to the pilot's ear, confirming that the systems designed to save his life are functional. He watches the red lights illuminate, engine 1, overheat, engine 2, overheat, wheel well fire, and then releases the button, allowing the silence to return, heavy and muffled. Now, the aircraft requires its own power source. He locates the APU switch, the auxiliary power unit, a small turbine engine located in the tail of the plane. He moves the switch to start, holding it for a second against the spring pressure, and then releases it to on. Somewhere, far behind him, deep in the fuselage, a low, rising hum begins, sounding like a distant wind gathering strength in a canyon. This is the sound of independence. The aircraft is severing its reliance on the ground power unit, preparing to breathe on its own. As the APU exhaust gas temperature gauge rises, the needle swinging upward with a steady, predictable sweep, Salmi would have felt a profound sense of calm settling over him. There is a specific frequency to the APU generator coming online, a high-pitched whine that laminates the air with white noise, drowning out the intrusive thoughts of discovery. When the blue APU gen-off bus's light illuminates, he flips the generator switches and the aircraft's electrical system transfers the load with a barely perceptible click, the lights in the cockpit brightening, the air conditioning packs beginning to hiss with fresh airflow. He moves to the flight management computer, the FMC, the brain of the Boeing 737. His fingers dance over the keypad, a tactile staccato that is the heartbeat of modern navigation. Ident, pos init. Route. He enters the airport reference code, EHAM for Amsterdam, LTAI for Antalya, and the computer responds by drawing a magenta line across the navigation display. A digital path through the sky that creates a future for the flight, a destiny that is fixed and observable. He enters the gross weight, checking the load sheet against the computer's calculation, ensuring the center of gravity is within limits. There is no room for improvisation here, no space for the creative fiction that birthed his license. The physics of the aircraft demand truth. If the weight is wrong, the lift calculations will be wrong, and the rotation speed V1, VR, V2 will be incorrect. Salmi loved this honesty. The plane did not care who he was. It only cared that the numbers balanced. Yaw damper on. The switch clicks, window heat on. Another click. He checks the pressurization panel, setting the cruise altitude to 37,000 feet, dialing in the numbers with a slow, deliberate rotation of the knob. He glances out the side window, where the rain-slicked tarmac reflects the flashing beacon lights of a taxiing Airbus, and he feels entirely woven into the fabric of the airport. This procedure, repeated 4, sometimes 5 times a day, became a form of meditation. Each switch flipped was a reaffirmation of his competence, a tangible proof that he belonged in the left seat. The boring paradox is simply this: the more routine the action, the less visible the actor becomes. By executing the startup flow with the grace of a virtuoso, Salme became transparent, a ghost in the machine who was indistinguishable from the thousands of other pilots performing the exact same sequence at the exact same moment around the world. Is there a comfort in routine for you? A safety in knowing that if you follow the steps, nothing can go wrong, even if your life is built on a secret? For Salme, the checklist was not a chore. It was a ritual of absolution. As long as the recall check showed no lights, as long as the hydraulic pressure was stable at 3,000 pounds per square inches, and as long as the fuel pumps were humming their monotone song, he was safe. The document in his bag was a static object, dormant and unseen. But the switches under his fingers were real, and his mastery of them was the only truth that mattered in the dark. He would scan the overhead panel one last time, his eyes moving in a specific Z pattern taught in every flight school, ensuring that no switch was out of place, that no amber light was glowing where a dark panel should be. The cockpit, now fully alive and vibrating with potential energy, felt like a velvet-lined cocoon, insulating him from the legal realities of the ground. In these moments, waiting for the pushback tug to lift the nose gear, Thomas Salme was not a fraud. He was a captain, sitting at the apex of his own private world, watching the horizon wait for his command. When the aircraft reaches its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, settling into the thin, rarefied air of the stratosphere, the cockpit undergoes a transformation, shifting from a place of mechanical activity into a chamber of profound, suspended isolation. In the dead of night, while crossing the dark expanse of the Mediterranean or the vast, unlit corridors of the Atlantic, the world outside the reinforced glass ceases to be a geography of nations and borders, dissolving instead into a uniform obsidian void, where the only reference points are the distant, cold light of the stars and the soft, amber glow of the flight instruments. It is within this silent orbit, surrounded by the rhythmic hum of the engines and the slow, hypnotic oscillation of the air currents, that the mind of the impostor begins to confront the sheer weight of the fiction he has constructed. We must consider the psychological texture of a life lived entirely in the conditional tense, a life where every interaction, every routine greeting, and every administrative update carries the dormant potential of catastrophe. For Thomas Salme, the act of flying the Boeing 737 was the easy part, a mechanical ballet of inputs and responses that he had mastered to a level of intuitive precision. The true labor, the exhausting, invisible work that drained the color from his days, was the maintenance of the mask itself. Imagine the simple, repetitive act of walking through an airport terminal, a process that for most pilots is a mundane transition between the hotel and the jet bridge, a blur of coffee shops and duty-free perfume counters. For Salme, however, the terminal was a labyrinth of potential exposure, a space populated by customs officers, security personnel, and aviation authority inspectors, each one representing a variable he could not control. Whenever he approached a passport control booth, holding his breath in a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart, He had to project an air of absolute boredom, offering his documents to the officer with a casual indifference that belied the electric current of fear running through his nervous system. He would watch the officer's eyes scan the laminate of his ID, waiting for the pause, the frown, or the second glance that would signal the end of his career. But time and again, the officer would simply nod, stamp the manifest, and wave him through. This repeated validation did not ease his anxiety. Rather, it layered a strange, hollow patina over his existence, reinforcing the idea that the system was not a fortress of security, but a theater of assumptions where the costume mattered more than the actor. The true test of his psychological endurance, however, did not come from the police, but from the industry's own relentless pursuit of safety. The biannual simulator check, or sim check. In the world of commercial aviation, a captain's competence is never assumed to be permanent. It must be proven, re-verified, and stamped every 6 months in a grueling 2-day examination that takes place inside a full-motion simulator. This is the breadcrumb that leads us to the central irony of the Phantom Captain's story. Legally, he was a fraud who should never have touched the controls. Yet practically, he was a pilot who could handle the most catastrophic failures the instructors could throw at him. Picture the environment of the simulator bay. A cavernous, windowless hall filled with the hum of hydraulics and the scent of heated electronics, where the simulator box sits on its 6-axis legs like a dormant mechanical beast. Inside, the atmosphere is tense, the air conditioning struggling to combat the heat generated by the computers and the nervous energy of the crew. Salmi would sit in the left seat, his hands resting lightly on the thrust levers, knowing that the instructor sitting behind him at the control station was about to initiate a sequence of disasters designed to break his composure. The scenario might begin with a V1 cut, an engine failure at the precise moment the aircraft reaches takeoff speed, requiring Salmi to wrestle the asymmetric thrust, keep the nose centered on the runway, and climb out on a single engine while running the emergency checklists from memory. Most imposters would crumble under this pressure, their lack of foundational training exposed by the complex demands of the aerodynamics. But Salmi did not crumble. He thrived. He executed the memory items with a robotic precision. Auto throttle, disengage, thrust lever confirm, fuel control switch cutoff, his voice calm and steady in the recorded silence of the simulator. He passed these checks every single time, receiving satisfactory marks from check airmen who had no idea they were grading a man with no license. There is a profound dissonance in this image. A man demonstrating master-class proficiency in a job he is forbidden to hold, saving a virtual aircraft from a virtual fire, while his real life burned quietly in the background. It raises an uncomfortable question about the nature of qualification. If the paper says you cannot fly, but your hands say you can, which reality is the truth? Yet, the proficiency checks were only half the battle. The administrative landscape of aviation is constantly shifting, with airlines merging, software systems updating, and new regulations drifting down from the authorities like snow. When Air One was absorbed, or when Corendon updated their crew management databases, Salme must have felt the walls of the labyrinth closing in, fearing that a new digital cross-check would finally link his name to the empty void in the Swedish archives. Every email from the head office, every request for updated personal data would have arrived with a frequency of dread, forcing him to fabricate new excuses, to delay, or to produce yet another forged document to satisfy the hunger of the bureaucracy. But let us return to the cockpit. to the long, silent hours of the night flight, where the fear was managed by the sheer beauty of the view. At 35,000 feet, far above the weather and the noise of humanity, there is a sense of being suspended in the ether, disconnected from the laws of the earth. Salmi would look out at the horizon, where the curvature of the planet was faintly visible against the star field, and perhaps feel a fleeting sense of peace, a resonance with the vastness of the universe that made his own troubles feel insignificant. In these moments, the cockpit became a confessional without a priest, a space where he could be his true self, a pilot who loved the sky while simultaneously being a criminal who had stolen his way into heaven. The rhythmic flashing of the strobe lights on the wingtips measured out the seconds of his stolen time, each flash a heartbeat, each hour a victory against the inevitable discovery. He was alone with the machine, and the machine did not judge him. It simply responded to his inputs, banking left when he turned the yoke, descending when he reduced the power, complicit in his deception through its mechanical indifference. The isolation of the command was absolute. He could not share his burden with the first officer sitting 3 feet away, could not confess his fears to his family, and could not seek reassurance from his friends. He was trapped in an orbit of his own making, circling the truth but never able to land on it, held aloft by the very skills that made his lie so convincing. As the years dragged on, the stress likely became a background static, a tinnitus of the soul that he learned to ignore, focusing instead on the next waypoint, the next frequency change, and the next safe landing that would buy him another day of freedom. As we trace the trajectory of Thomas Salmi's career across the map of Europe, we uncover a pattern of movement that resembles the migration of a bird navigating by magnetic fields, instinctive, precise, and driven by the necessity of survival. He did not remain static in one location where his history might eventually catch up to him, but instead allowed the currents of the aviation industry to carry him from one contract to another, moving between jurisdictions with the ease of a man who understands that bureaucracy is often fragmented by national borders. His journey took him first to the sun-drenched runways of Italy, where he flew for Air One, a carrier where the operations were perhaps defined by a slightly more relaxed rhythm than the rigid Scandinavian discipline he was accustomed to. In the cockpits of Air One's fleet, surrounded by the chatter of Italian air traffic control, a melodic, rapid-fire cadence that filled the radio frequencies, Salmi solidified his reputation not as an outsider, but as a dependable professional who could be trusted with the complex approaches into airports like Milan, Linate, or Naples. From there, the wind carried him further, through various contracts that eventually led him to Corendon Airlines, a Dutch-Turkish operator known for its holiday charters to the Mediterranean coast. It is here, within the corporate structure of Corendon, that the story reaches a level of irony that feels almost literary in its construction, a paradox so profound that it questions the very nature of competence and certification. In a system designed to filter out the unqualified, Thomas Salmi was not merely tolerated. He was celebrated, promoted, and eventually elevated to the rank of training captain. Consider the resonance of that title for a moment. Training captain. It implies a mastery so complete, a knowledge of the Boeing 737 so encyclopedic, that the airline entrusts this individual with the sacred duty of molding the next generation of pilots. The man who possessed no legal right to sit in the cockpit was now the ultimate authority in it, grading legitimate pilots on their performance, signing off on their logbooks with a pen that he held with the steady hand of a surgeon. How does one reconcile this contradiction? It suggests that while his paperwork was a hollow shell, his skill was made of obsidian, hard, sharp, and undeniably real. When he sat in the jump seat behind a junior first officer, observing their instrument scan and correcting their flare technique during a crosswind landing, he was offering genuine wisdom harvested from thousands of hours of stolen experience. He knew the manuals not just as text to be memorized, but as a living philosophy of survival, having studied every diagram, every circuit breaker location, and every emergency procedure until they were etched into the neural pathways of his brain. He would open the thick, leather-bound training catalog, turning the pages with a reverence that commanded respect, pointing out the subtle nuances of the hydraulic systems or the electrical buses to students who had spent years earning the licenses that Salme had simply fabricated. Did he feel a flicker of guilt as he failed a student for a minor infraction, or did he compartmentalize that emotion, burying it deep in the archive of his mind alongside the secret of his own origin? Perhaps he felt that by enforcing the standards so rigorously on others, he was paying a debt to the universe, ensuring that even if he was a fraud, the pilots he trained would be safe, competent, and legitimate. This situation forces us to confront an uncomfortable question that hangs in the air like the lingering smoke of an extinguished candle. What defines an expert? Is it the paper in the file, stamped and laminated by a government administrator who has never touched the controls of an aircraft? Or is it the hands on the wheel, the intuition that senses a change in the wind shear before the instruments detect it, and the ability to bring a 70-ton machine safely to the earth in the middle of a thunderstorm? The irony is thick and heavy, settling over the narrative like a fog. The system that was built to stop him ended up promoting him, because the system looks for boxes to check, and Salme checked every box with a performance that was indistinguishable from the truth. He wore the 4 stripes on his epaulettes not as a costume, but as a second skin, and his colleagues at Corendon looked at him and saw only the reflection of their own expectations. He was the mirror in which the airline saw what it wanted to see: a seasoned, graying captain with a steady voice and a perfect safety record. As he walked through the dispatch office, collecting the flight plans for a training sortie, the logos of the airline on the wall seemed to validate him, offering a corporate embrace that shielded him from the cold reality of the law. He had become a pillar of the very establishment he was deceiving, a structural load-bearing beam in a house of cards. The training manuals he carried were heavy, filled with the collective knowledge of aviation history, and he treated them with a care that suggested he knew their value better than anyone because, for him, that knowledge was the only thing that was real. In the next and final chapter of this procedural dissection, we must watch as the oscillation of fate finally swings back, and the dormant digital systems of the modern world wake up to find the error in the code. But for now, let us leave him in the right seat, instructing a nervous trainee on the finer points of the glide slope, a phantom teaching the living how to fly. Deep within the infrastructure of the modern state, hidden far beneath the tangible world of tarmac and jet fuel, there exists a silent, humming universe of data, a labyrinth of servers and optical cables that grew quietly alongside Thomas Salme's career. While he was busy perfecting the manual handling of the Boeing 737 inches, the skies above Europe, the ground beneath him was shifting, transitioning from the chaotic, forgiving era of paper archives into the cold, obsidian precision of the digital age. The mechanism that would eventually dismantle his 13-year masquerade was not a mistake made in the air. No missed radio call, no heavy landing, nor any deviation from the glide slope, but rather a bureaucratic algorithm. A dormant line of code that woke up one morning in a government office in Sweden. We must visualize this moment not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a slow zoom into the sterile environment of a server room, where the only sound is the rhythmic oscillation of cooling fans and the flickering green light of network activity. The Swedish Civil Aviation Administration, in an effort to modernize its vast catalog of pilot certifications, had begun the tedious process of digitizing its old records, transferring the physical files of the 1,990 seconds into a centralized, searchable database. It was a project defined by monotony, a task of data entry and cross-referencing that was likely performed by administrators who had never stepped foot in a cockpit. Yet it was here, in this translation from ink to pixel, that the thread began to unravel. When the system reached the file for Thomas Salmi, it encountered a logical fracture, a fragment of data that did not align with the mathematical reality of the registry. The computer, indifferent to the human story or the years of safe flying, simply noted that the permit number associated with his name did not correspond to a valid air transport pilot license in the master archive. There were no sirens, no flashing red lights on a wall, and no immediate panic. There was simply a quiet flag, a digital marker placed next to a name, signaling a discrepancy that required human review. The transmission of this discovery moved through the ether with a terrifying lack of urgency, traveling as a standard email notification from the Swedish authorities to their counterparts in the Netherlands. We must appreciate the slowness of this process, the way the accusation drifted across international borders, not with the speed of a bullet, but with the pacing of a piece of inter-office mail. The email likely sat in an inbox for hours, perhaps even days, buried under a pile of routine inquiries about noise abatement and runway maintenance, waiting for a coffee-drinking inspector to click it open and realize the magnitude of what he was reading. The jurisdiction for the interception fell to the Dutch authorities because Salmi was, at that time, operating out of Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, flying for Corendon Airlines, a carrier that utilized the Dutch hub for its holiday routes. The investigation was handed over to the Koninklijke Marechaussee, the Royal Military Police, who are responsible for security at Schiphol. Yet, even as the police were notified, the response was defined by a calm, procedural coordination that mirrored the aviation industry itself. They did not rush to the tarmac with weapons drawn. Instead, they consulted the flight rosters, checking the arrival boards with the same casual interest as a taxi driver waiting for a fare. They identified that the Phantom captain was scheduled to pilot a Boeing 737-800 from Antalya, Turkey, back to Amsterdam, a flight that would take approximately 3.5 hours. During those hours, as Salmi cruised at 37,000 feet, chatting with his co-pilot and monitoring the fuel flow, the ground authorities were quietly arranging his reception, printing out the necessary paperwork, and assigning a small team of plainclothes officers to meet the aircraft at the gate. It is a haunting image to consider. The aircraft descending through the clouds, the landing gear extending with a heavy mechanical thud, and the tires kissing the rain-slicked runway of Schiphol, all while the trap lay open and waiting. Salmi taxied the aircraft to the gate, following the yellow guidelines with his usual precision, shutting down the engines and turning off the seatbelt sign, completely unaware that the frequency of his life had already changed. The police waited until the passengers had disembarked, allowing the routine of the flight to conclude with dignity, respecting the sacred space of the aircraft until it was empty. When they finally stepped onto the jet bridge and entered the cockpit, the interaction was muffled and polite, a conversation between professionals rather than a raid. They asked for his documents, the very papers he had laminated and protected for so long, and as he handed them over, the weight of the 13 years likely evaporated into the static of the cabin air. The catch was not a result of detective work in the traditional sense, but of the inevitable encroachment of the digital horizon, a closing of the loop that left no room for the analog ghosts of the past. The system had finally synchronized, and in that moment of synchronization, the phantom captain ceased to exist, leaving only Thomas Salmi, a man standing in a uniform he had worn so well, yet never truly owned. The gray skies of Amsterdam in May possess a specific, muted quality, a flat diffusion of light that seems to press down on the tarmac of Schiphol Airport, creating an atmosphere that is both industrial and strangely melancholic. On this particular morning in 2010, the Boeing 737 sat at Gate D, a dormant beast tethered to the terminal by the umbilical of the jet bridge, while the ground crew moved with their usual rhythmic efficiency around the landing gear. Inside the flight deck, Thomas Salmi was already settled into the left seat, his hands moving through the pre-flight flow with the practiced ease of a man who had performed this ritual 10,000 times before, preparing the systems for a routine departure to Ankara with 101 passengers settling into the cabin behind him. There is a profound dissonance between the catastrophic nature of what was about to happen and the absolute quiet in which it occurred. The end of 13 years of deception did not arrive with the screech of tires or the wail of sirens, but with the soft, almost apologetic sound of footsteps on the flight deck floor. The police did not storm the aircraft with weapons drawn, nor did they disrupt the boarding process which was proceeding with the orderly shuffle of luggage and the murmur of travelers finding their seats. Instead, they waited until the stillness was absolute, respecting the sanctity of the cockpit until the very last moment, approaching the door with the professional courtesy one might expect from a ground handling agent delivering a final load sheet. The knock was soft, polite, and barely audible over the low hum of the avionics cooling fans. When the door opened, revealing the uniformed officers of the Dutch police standing in the narrow galley, the conversation that followed was conducted in the hushed tones of a library, devoid of aggression or drama. "Captain, may we see your papers?" they asked, a question that Salmi had been anticipating in his nightmares for over a decade. Yet now that it hung in the air, it felt less like an accusation and more like a release. He did not fight, nor did he attempt to bluff his way through the encounter with the confident deflections that had served him so well in the past. Rather, he seemed to exhale a breath he had been holding since 1997, his shoulders dropping as the immense, invisible weight of the labyrinth finally slid from his back. There was no need for handcuffs or physical restraint, for the resistance had left him the moment the question was asked. In a gesture that was both tragic and deeply symbolic, he reached up to his epaulets, the gold stripes that signified a rank he had earned in skill but stolen in law, and tore them from his shirt, placing them on the center pedestal with a finality that echoed louder than any slamming prison door. The relief of the secret ending was likely a complex, oscillating emotion, a mixture of shame for the deception and a profound, exhausted gratitude that he no longer had to wake up every morning wondering if this would be the day the sky fell down. As he gathered his flight bag, leaving the cockpit of the Boeing 737 for the last time, he walked past the passengers who were still buckling their seatbelts, completely unaware that the pilot who was supposed to fly them to Turkey was being quietly escorted into history. The rain began to streak the windows again, blurring the view of the terminal, washing away the clear lines of the runway until everything dissolved into a soft, gray static. The weather in Amsterdam in May of 2010 was characterized by the same gray, slate-colored skies that had greeted Thomas Salmi on so many mornings throughout his career. A persistent, low-hanging cloud layer that seemed to press the city of canals down into the earth. At Schiphol Airport, a sprawling complex of glass and steel that serves as one of the great arterial hubs of European travel. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp concrete and the exhaust of 1,000 engines. Salmi's aircraft, a Corendon Airlines Boeing 737-800, sat parked at Gate D, a massive, dormant beast tethered to the terminal by the umbilical of the jet bridge, while the ground crew below busied themselves with the choreography of the turnaround. Inside the cockpit, the environment was one of practiced calm, a sanctuary where Salmi felt most at home, surrounded by the familiar geometry of the throttle quadrant and the soft, amber luminescence of the standby instruments. He was preparing for a scheduled departure to Ankara, a flight path he knew by heart, and behind the reinforced door, 101 passengers were settling into their seats, stowing their luggage and buckling their belts, completely unaware that their captain was a man living on borrowed time. The pre-flight checklist was complete, the fuel load was verified, and the route was programmed into the flight management computer, creating a magenta line that stretched across the digital map, a promise of a journey that would never begin. The end of the 13-year masquerade did not arrive with the screeching tires of a SWAT team van or the shattering of glass, nor was there any of the chaotic urgency one might expect from a high-stakes apprehension. Instead, the unraveling of the phantom captain's life occurred with the quiet, bureaucratic precision of a library closing for the night. The Dutch police, specifically the Koninklijke Marechaussee, who patrol the border spaces of the airport, did not storm the fuselage with weapons drawn. Rather, they waited at the top of the jet bridge, respecting the sanctity of the aircraft until the last passenger had boarded. They walked down the sloping tunnel with a slow, deliberate cadence, their footsteps muffled by the industrial carpet, approaching the open cockpit door not as adversaries, but as messengers of a reality that could no longer be denied. The knock on the doorframe was soft, almost polite, a gentle intrusion into the sealed world of the flight deck that shattered the illusion more effectively than a battering ram ever could. When Salmi turned in his seat, looking over his shoulder to see the uniformed officers standing in the narrow entryway, there was no need for a dramatic explanation or a feigned confusion. "Captain," one of the officers said, his voice calm and devoid of malice, "may we see your papers?" In that singular moment, the air in the cockpit seemed to still, the oscillation of the cooling fans fading into a background static that sounded like the ocean in a seashell. Salmi looked at the men, then at the documents he had protected for over a decade, the laminated shield that had deflected inquiry for so long, and he realized that the game had finally reached its terminal point. He did not fight, he did not attempt to sprint across the tarmac or spin a new web of lies to entrap the officers. Instead, a profound sense of resignation washed over him, a feeling that was perhaps indistinguishable from relief. He reached up to his shoulders, where the 4 gold stripes of a captain sat proudly on his epaulets, the universal symbol of authority and competence in aviation. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unbuttoned them and tore them off, placing the fabric strips on the center console next to the throttle levers. It was a gesture of surrender that was both tragic and dignified. an acknowledgment that while he possessed the skill of a captain, he no longer claimed the title. He stood up, gathered his leather flight bag, the repository of his secrets, and walked off the plane, leaving the cockpit empty and the dream behind him, escorted into the labyrinth of the terminal not as a pilot, but as a passenger in his own life. The transition from the flight deck to the courtroom was a shift from a world of dynamic motion to one of static, heavy silence, where dust motes floated in the beams of light that filtered through the high windows of the Dutch Hall of Justice. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest were characterized by a strange lack of animosity, a recognition by the court that while the law had been broken, the moral landscape of the crime was complex and filled with shades of gray. Thomas Salme stood before the judge not as a villain who had endangered lives with reckless abandon, but as an anomaly, a man who had successfully performed a job he was technically forbidden to do. The prosecution presented the facts. For 13 years, Salme had flown commercial airliners without a valid air transport pilot license, accumulating over 10,000 flight hours on false pretenses. The weight of the deception was undeniable, a massive fraud perpetrated against multiple airlines and aviation authorities. Yet, as the evidence was laid out, a contradictory truth began to emerge from the files. The records showed no accidents, no incidents, and no reports of unsafe conduct. In fact, they showed a pilot who was often praised for his smoothness and his adherence to safety protocols. The sentence, when it was finally handed down, reflected this paradox. He was not sentenced to years in a prison cell, nor was he branded a public enemy. Instead, the Dutch court fined him 2,000 euros, a sum that seems almost trivial when compared to the magnitude of the lie, and issued a ban preventing him from flying commercial aircraft for a period of 12 months. The leniency of the punishment was a tacit admission that while the bureaucracy had been deceived, the public had not been endangered in the practical sense. We might use an analogy to understand the court's perspective. Imagine a pianist who plays a perfect, soul-stirring concerto in a grand concert hall, receiving a standing ovation from the audience, only for it to be revealed later that he never attended the conservatory. The lack of a degree does not retroactively make the music discordant. The performance was real, the skill was undeniable, and the audience was moved, even if the credentials were a fabrication. Salme was the uncredentialed virtuoso of the skies, a man who played the instrument of the Boeing 737 with a proficiency that rendered the license irrelevant to the physics of flight, if not to the law of the land. Today, the loop is closed. Thomas Salme has returned to the ground, stepping out of the ether and back into the ordinary gravity of daily life. He has returned to his original passion, photography, capturing the world through a lens rather than watching it pass beneath a wing. He lives quietly, a man with a secret history that is now a matter of public record, a dormant chapter in the archives of aviation lore. The uniform is gone, the laminate has been destroyed, and the obsession that drove him to the upper atmosphere has been grounded, leaving him to walk the earth like the rest of us, looking up at the contrails with a knowledge that only he possesses. And now, as we reach the end of our descent, let us return to the image of the airport at night, after the last flight has landed and the terminal has fallen into a hush. The rain has returned, a gentle, rhythmic drumming against the glass that blurs the runway lights into soft, glowing orbs of amber and red. The aircraft, parked at the remote stands, are dark and silent, their engines cooling in the damp air, their systems powered down and resting. The jazz saxophone returns, drifting in from the distance, slow and heavy with reverb, accompanied by the deep, resonant drone that anchors us in this space of relaxation. The turbulence of the story has passed. The anxiety of the deception has dissolved into the obsidian night, leaving only a sense of calm resolution. The file on the Phantom Captain is closed, its pages smoothed and returned to the shelf in the great, dusty archive of the noir sleep detective. The skies are clear of secrets now. The horizon is empty. If you are still with us, listening to the sound of the rain and the low hum of the silence, allow yourself to drift further into the comfort of the dark. There are no more checklists to run, no more frequencies to monitor, and no more masks to wear. You are safe here, suspended in the quiet space between waking and sleeping. Consider subscribing to the Noir Sleep Detective for more cases from the archives, where we explore the shadows of the past to help you find peace in the present. Share this case with others who need to disconnect from the noise of the world and drift away into the ether. The engines are off, the cabin is dark, the journey is complete. Sleep well, detective.